A plane is flying over Panama. If you look closely at the tail, it's spraying something. You might think they're spraying pesticides, but in reality, they're dropping flies. They are literally dumping tens of millions of flies right out of the sky. If you're wondering what on earth is going on, we have to go back to 2016. Big Pine Key, down in the Florida Keys. This is home to the key deer, a small, adorable, endangered species. But one day, these gentle creatures started shaking their heads uncontrollably. After receiving reports from locals, veterinarians went to investigate, and the scene they encountered was absolutely gruesome. There were gaping holes right on top of the deer's heads and the backs of their necks, with the flesh eaten away so badly that you could see their white skulls. The culprits were none other than fly larvae, maggots. Tens of thousands of maggots were swarming inside the open wounds. And the most shocking part, the deer were still alive. Just what exactly is this fly that eats animals alive, and why are scientists carrying out this bizarre operation of dumping millions of them over Panama? This pest is known as the New World screwworm fly, with the scientific name Cochleomya hominivirax. The name might sound unfamiliar, but here in the US, it's notorious for being an absolute menace. While it looks just like an ordinary fly, its method of reproduction is exceptionally gruesome. Unlike typical flies that lay their eggs in garbage or carcasses, the female screwworm actively seeks out the open wounds of living, warm-blooded animals. Livestock and wildlife like cattle, pigs, and deer are the primary targets, but pets like dogs and cats and even humans are no exception. In fact, records from 1858 on Devil's Island, the infamous French penal colony, show cases where these maggots burrowed into prisoners' noses, mouths, and ears, causing fatal brain infections. That's exactly why this insect earned the terrifying nickname the man-eater bug. The female fly in particular has an incredible sense of smell. Whether it's the umbilical cord of a newborn calf, a tiny tick bite, or just the scent of blood from a minor scrape against barbed wire, she will fly in immediately and lay anywhere from 200 to 400 eggs right into the wound. To make matters worse, these eggs hatch into larvae in just 12 hours and instantly begin their feast. As the name screwworm implies, these larvae literally corkscrew their way deep into the living flesh of the animal. As they dig in, they secrete fluids that cause the surrounding tissue to rot, which simultaneously produces a horrific foul odor. This smell acts as a beacon, attracting even more female flies in the area. What starts as a single fly's batch of eggs turns into a massive, gaping wound swarming with thousands of maggots in just a matter of days. Just like the key deer we talked about earlier. Animals infected like this endure agonizing pain and usually die from organ damage or sepsis. Historically, these screwworm flies ranged from Central and South America all the way up to the American South, tormenting ranchers. Before the 1950s, ranchers in Texas and across the South considered this pest an absolute nightmare. Because the umbilical cords of newborn calves were their favorite breeding grounds, ranchers back then would spend their entire day squatting down in the dirt, inspecting the hindquarters and navels of their cattle just to check for screwworm infections. Statistics from that era showed that the economic damage in the American South alone reached hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Adjusted for today's inflation, we're talking about an astronomical figure in the billions of dollars. And it wasn't just livestock. Human infections were alarmingly common as well. Naturally, they tried using pesticides, but the sheer volume of flies made total eradication nothing more than a pipe dream. Then, in the 1930s, a young entomologist came up with a brilliant idea to wipe out these flies. That man was Dr. Edward Knipling, an entomologist with the USDA. Having grown up helping out on his father's farm, he was intimately familiar with the gruesome damage screwworms inflicted on livestock. So, after becoming an entomologist, he dedicated himself to researching how to stop their reproduction. While closely analyzing their life cycle, he uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle. While male flies mate with multiple females throughout their lives, a female fly mates only once in her entire life. Some of you might already see where this is going. Dr. Knipling realized that if they could artificially create sterile males and release them into the wild en masse, it would be a game changer. The logic was simple. When a wild female fly goes looking for a mate, what if we've already flooded the area with massive numbers of sterile males? Statistically, the female is highly likely to mate with a sterile male, and because the sperm's chromosomes are damaged, any eggs she lays will die in the early embryonic stage. If they could release 10 times as many sterile males as wild males, the population of the next generation would absolutely plummet. He concluded that repeating this process would ultimately drive the screwworm population to total collapse. This was the birth of the sterile insect technique, or SIT. In theory, it was flawless, but there was one massive practical hurdle. How on earth do you mass sterilize tens of millions of flies? That's when another scientist stepped in to crack this exact problem. His name was Dr. Raymond Bushland. At the time, the scientific community knew that high doses of radiation could destroy the DNA inside an organism's reproductive cells. Drawing on this, Dr. Bushland made an incredible proposal to Knipling. Let's irradiate the flies, not enough to kill them, but just enough to scramble the chromosomes in the male's sperm. So the two of them secretly borrowed X-ray equipment from the Army hospital where Bushland worked and began their experiments. They placed fly pupae into the X-ray machine, testing various doses of radiation and analyzing the results. They discovered that if they exposed the pupae to the right amount of radiation on the 5th or 6th day of their development, the flies would hatch perfectly healthy, but the chromosomes in the male's sperm would be completely obliterated. While the initial experiments used X-rays, they later switched to gamma rays emitted by cobalt-60 when they scaled up for mass production. There's one very important detail here. The irradiated sperm isn't completely inactive. It successfully fertilizes the egg, but because the DNA inside is damaged, the fertilized egg simply dies off during the embryonic development stage. So the female goes about her life thinking she is successfully mated, but the eggs she lays are doomed to never hatch. Fast forward to 1954, and SIT was put to its first massive real-world test. The location was the Caribbean island of Curaçao. Isolated by the ocean, it had very few external variables, making it the perfect testing ground. The research team packed the sterile male flies into cardboard boxes, loaded them onto planes, and peppered the entire island with them. So, what happened? For the first few weeks, much didn't change. Wild maggots were still being found, and critics mocked the project as an insane waste of taxpayer money. But incredibly, after 10 weeks, everything flipped. The hatch rate of eggs laid by wild females plummeted to practically 0%. In just a few months, the screwworm fly vanished completely from the island of Curaçao. It was a historic moment, the first time humanity successfully weaponized an insect's sex life to eradicate a pest. Riding high on the success in Curaçao, the USDA launched a full-scale eradication campaign on the U.S. mainland in 1957. Starting in Florida and sweeping through Texas all the way to California, the military began airdropping cardboard boxes packed with hundreds of millions of sterile flies. To supply this massive operation, a sprawling sterile fly production facility was built in Mission, Texas. It was quite literally a gigantic maggot farm. But this created yet another logistical nightmare. As I mentioned earlier, these flies feast on raw, living flesh. Breeding hundreds of millions of these flies required an unimaginably massive supply of meat. Initially, they fed the flies a mixture of ground beef and blood, but the costs quickly became prohibitive. Eventually, they started using whatever they could get their hands on: horse meat, and even the meat of the nutria, an invasive swamp rat that was wreaking havoc on the Louisiana wetlands at the time. According to records from around 1962, the facility was burning through roughly 220,000 pounds of meat and 10,000 gallons of blood every single week. Just try to imagine the smell inside a factory where hundreds of millions of maggots are devouring rotting meat. Actually, you probably shouldn't. Historical accounts note that the stench was so repulsive that airlines frequently refused to transport the flies, forcing workers to douse the boxes in cheap cologne just to get them onto the planes. Regardless of the methods, this overwhelming numbers game paid off. By 1966, the U.S. officially eradicated the screwworm fly from the American South. But it was too early to let our guard down, because the fly's native habitat stretches deep into Central and South America. Failing to block the constant wave of flies moving north from Mexico would render the U.S. eradication efforts completely useless. So the U.S. teamed up with Mexico in a massive campaign to push the flies further and further south. As a result, they pushed them down through Mexico in the 1970s, Guatemala and El Salvador in the 80s, and all the way through Honduras and Nicaragua by the 90s. They essentially swept the continent clean, driving the flies all the way down to the narrowest edge of North America. In 2006, they established a 24/7 sterile male production facility near Panama. Pumping out up to 100 million sterile flies every week, they carpet-bombed the jungle canopies, creating an ironclad blockade against any northern migration. On the ground, inspectors rode motorcycles and horses from village to village, checking livestock wounds one by one to maintain the quarantine. Thanks to these monumental efforts, the U.S., Mexico, and Central America remained free from the nightmare of the screwworm for nearly 20 years. But then, in 2022, cracks began to show in this airtight defense system. Infections in Panama, which usually hovered around 25 cases a year, skyrocketed to a staggering 9,300 cases in 2023 alone. Why the sudden outbreak? Experts point to the butterfly effect of the COVID-19 pandemic as the primary cause. The pandemic caused indefinite delays in maintaining crucial equipment at the Panama facility, and with field inspectors unable to conduct their usual patrols, the entire quarantine net effectively collapsed. The second, and arguably more devastating issue, was cattle smuggling. Every year, roughly 800,000 head of cattle are illegally raised in nature reserves across Central America and then smuggled into Mexico via trucks and boats. This created the worst-case scenario: screwworm-infected cattle bypassing the defensive barrier entirely and moving north. Consequently, outbreaks exploded in Costa Rica in 2023, followed by Nicaragua in early 2024, and in just 10 weeks, they tore through Honduras and Guatemala, finally reaching southern Mexico and breeding there by late 2024. You might be thinking, what's the big deal if a few flies made it back to Mexico? The reality is, it means an exponential increase in the sheer amount of territory we have to defend. Before, we only had to plug a very narrow bottleneck in Panama, but now that they've breached the vast territory of Mexico, the quarantine zone has multiplied dozens of times over. Back in the golden age of eradication in Mexico, multiple sterile fly facilities were running round the clock in both Mexico and Texas, giving us the massive infrastructure to drop up to 500 million flies a week. But after achieving their initial goals, most of those factories were shuttered. Today, sterile fly production is drastically under-resourced and simply cannot keep pace with the speed of the outbreak. With the situation becoming this critical, scientists are stepping up with a more efficient technology that goes beyond the old methods. It's called gene drive technology. Traditional SIT relied on radiation, which often left the irradiated males lethargic and weaker than the wild counterparts, making it much less likely for females to choose them as mates. To overcome this, we had to rely on sheer volume, flooding the area with an absurd number of flies. But with CRISPR gene editing technology, the game completely changes. Scientists can precisely edit the DNA of male flies in a lab. This edited gene has zero effect on the male himself, but if he mates with a wild female, it acts as a powerful genetic switch that renders only the female offspring of the next generation completely sterile. Meanwhile, the male offspring carrying this gene are just as healthy and robust as wild males. They go out, find more wild females, and continue spreading the sterility gene. Here is the truly mind-blowing part. Typically, a gene only has a 50% chance of being passed down to offspring, but thanks to the unique mechanism of CRISPR, this gene actually cuts out the normal gene and literally copies and pastes itself in its place. This guarantees a 100% inheritance rate, meaning that with each passing generation, the number of sterile females grows exponentially, ultimately causing the entire population to collapse in on itself. Unlike the brute force numbers game of traditional SIT, gene drive technology is revolutionary. By releasing just a fraction of the flies, we can completely wipe out the fertile females and dismantle the wild populations from within. Unfortunately, deploying this directly into the wild right now carries significant risks. There's a real risk of an unforeseen mutation causing the gene to act in unintended ways, and if this gene were to accidentally cross over into a different species of fly, it could trigger irreversible, catastrophic disruptions across the entire ecosystem. You might have thought that this New World screwworm problem was just someone else's issue, happening deep in some distant Central American jungle. But this threat is hitting far closer to home than you might realize. You can feel it the next time you walk down the meat aisle at your local grocery store. Behind the staggering 53% spike in beef prices since 2019, the devastation this fly spread is causing to the livestock industry is undeniably playing a major role. But it goes way beyond grocery store inflation. This is a critical threat that could shake the very foundations of our multi-billion-dollar American livestock industry. How this grueling defensive war against the screwworm plays out on our southern border is directly tied to our wallets, so we'll need to keep a very close eye on it. And that brings us to today's final thought. We firmly believed we had conquered nature with an army of hundreds of millions of sterile fly special ops, but ultimately it was our own shallow greed driving cattle smuggling and a momentary lapse in vigilance that tore down our own impenetrable walls. The true culprit that sparked this deadly butterfly effect, raising the price of beef on our dinner tables, might not be a swarm of grotesque flies at all, but perhaps humanity itself. This has been Flat Archive. Thank you for watching.